We now turn to Lord Cope, who discussed with me earlier British police and security in Palestine. John Cope retired recently from the House of Lords after a distinguished career as an MP, then a peer. In particular, and relevant to the conversation we had, John was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Security Minister in Northern Ireland under direct rule from London, responsible for the police, prisons, and troops in support of the civil power. Today, he is patron of the British Palestine Police Association. The British Palestine Police were created in 1920 and served until 1948. John, I know, takes a keen interest in equal rights. His wife, Jamila, was born in Palestine, and he is the former chair of Pal Music UK, a good British charity, friends of the Edward Said National Conservatory of Music. And John played a key role in bringing the Palestine Youth Orchestra to Britain in 2016 for a very, very successful tour, including the proms. Jamila, John's wife, is a very active trustee of the Spafford Children's Centre in Jerusalem, in the Old City, helping Palestinian children, young children. I asked John Cope to describe the work of the British Palestine Police from their creation in 1920. So now we will hear from John.
The original plan, which was implemented immediately in 1920, was for very few British officers, about 17 actually, to be in command of the police force recruited locally. And that, which was 10 times that number, so about best part of 2,000 in total. Mainly Arab, of course, both Christian and Muslim, and about 10% Jews, which was approximately the population at the time. And they were taken over from, to a certain extent, the whole thing was taken over from the Turks as they withdrew, but also locally recruited. And as I say, British officers to set the tone, as it were. But it very rapidly, certainly by 1922, became apparent that it was very difficult to police public order, riots, by the Arabs doing it with policing Arabs, or Jews policing Jews for that matter. And of course, both were involved in starting and continuing the riots that got going. And it was very difficult for an individual policeman living in the community, close communities, to actually act vigorously and impartially in a riot in this situation, when they obviously very likely agreed strongly with the policy advocated by the rioters, whichever side it was. And so more and more British policemen were recruited because they were impartial. And it was set up the so-called gendarmerie, and then amalgamated into the police itself, until the police were more than 50% actually British at all ranks, but particularly the senior ranks, of course, were always British. So that by 1948 there were 4,000 British policemen in the force, of whom quite a lot were young. They were national servicemen doing their national service in the Palestine Police instead of the Army or the Air Force or whatever. And they came out, of course, knowing very little about it. At the time of 48, 2,500 of them had less than 2 years service. And they were young, 19, 20, this sort of thing, and not having any background information, as it were, about the history of the thing.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, comparatively few of the junior ranks at any rate, initially speaking Arabic or Hebrew. The languages were much better in the senior ranks, and of course the ones who served for any length of time got good at it. And the patrols, in any case, were always joint. At least most of the time were joint. British policemen, but also with Arab or Jewish policemen with them as well, and that helped obviously with the language point of view.
Right. It might just be worth mentioning the repression of the Arab Revolt 36 to 39, which was essentially the work of the British Army, and yeah. I think your point is key, that those who were involved pre-war, between 1920 and 1939, were very different from the police and indeed the soldiers who came after World War II. Well,
again, the thing changed a bit because there were very few army military in Palestine at the beginning. As soon as the forces of General Allenby had left, there wasn't a battalion in Palestine in 1920, 1922. They had to send for troops from Egypt when rioting occurred, when they needed them. And but later on, of course, there were several battalions there backing up the police, and they were less connected with the local society. Didn't speak the language. Even the officers obviously didn't speak Arabic or Hebrew for the most part, and and they, by definition, had come out for relatively brief tours, as opposed to being embedded like the police were in the community.
Yep. To quote Sir Henry Gurney, the top British civil servant in Palestine, as chief secretary at the very end of the mandate between 46 and 48, and I quote, "In fact, the last 30 years in this country, in Palestine, have seen nothing but fluctuations of policy, British policy, hesitations, or no policy at all." Now, he said that 2 months before departure, before the departure from Haifa that we witnessed in the film clip. Would you say he was right?
Yes, I would. The fact is that I don't think, even at the time, that the Jewish national home was ever properly defined. Nobody quite knew what they meant by it, what the government meant by it. Zionists, particularly the strong Zionists, meant exactly what it's turned out to mean. That's to say that the land should be taken over by Jews and run by them entirely, and the inhabitants at the time could be basically ignored. But I don't think that was Balfour's idea of what it turned out to be, or very, and of course in those days, although there'd been pogroms in Poland and in Russia and Eastern Europe generally, and so there were Jews who required a national home, as it were, required somewhere to go, who were refugees from appalling things. They were not. It wasn't the Holocaust yet. But as the 30s went on, and particularly when you get into the 1940s, then everybody increasingly realized that the Holocaust existed and was getting worse and worse, and there were more and more refugees with whom people in Britain had a lot of sympathy, obviously, and Palestine seemed to be one of the answers, or part of the answer. But the trouble was Palestine wasn't big enough. And immigration was increasingly a problem for the police and the military from the late 30s onwards. And the fact of immigration and the large amounts of immigration of Jews made the Arab revolt, was the cause of the Arab revolt, really, because it became obvious that there was a determination to try and take over the place. Then, of course, became much more difficult to police it at all, and the military were much more involved.
Perhaps just saying a word about the military and perhaps the police. Britain armed and trained Jewish settlers, I think particularly during the 20s and 30s, arguing that they needed help to protect their settlements. And is it fair to say that British treatment of the settlers, Jewish settlers, incomers, and of the indigenous Arab population was anything but even-handed?
Well, I think the British intention was, and a lot of the execution of it too, was even-handed, undoubtedly. But you're right that some of the, particularly the more isolated Jewish settlements, got attacked and said, "Look, we need to defend ourselves." Of course, a lot of people had firearms, which both legal and illegal firearms, and the government did allow them to have some firearms and trained them a bit and so on, in order that they were able to protect their own settlements, because we were unable to do it when they were isolated. It was if they got attacked, it took time to get assistance to them. And so we did undoubtedly support some settlements in this way.
Just turning to the police specifically, given your role as patron of the British Palestine Police Association, and thinking about people that you've met who served in the post-war period, you'll have met some of them and their families and their descendants. And as you said earlier, the composition of the force changed greatly over the 3 decades of British rule. If you can say a word about the people you've met and what you've learned about the 45 to 48 contingent.
Well, by definition, of course, somebody who was 18 in 1948 is 92 now. Have been approaching that age in the few years I've been involved with the association. So they were all young men at the time. But nevertheless, I know something of those who were the commanders of it. And I think it's very interesting that they, Ryman Jones, who was well, he wasn't the commissioner of the police right at the end, but he was at a late stage in the 40s, and he said that by 1948, by the beginning of 1948, British policing as known in Britain had been largely abandoned, and this today's is partly to do with the actual end of the mandate. And one of the problems, as far as policing are concerned, is clear to me, partly from personal, having heard it directly, but it's also fairly obvious, actually. The end of the mandate was announced in September 1947 as going to happen in May the next year. And that was a very long transitional period. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this. The United Nations was supposed to move in and organize the partition properly. But of course, it was a complete flop. It didn't manage to do that at all. But it was a very long transitional period. Now, if you're a policeman and you're trying to arrest somebody for stealing or whatever, what's the point of arresting him if you don't know whether you're ever going to be able to bring him to court and have him sent to prison or whatever? Dealing with ordinary crime becomes impossible when the whole system of justice is up in the air and patently not going to happen in any recognisable form until things settle down again. Yep. And so there was an awful long gap, which must have been awfully difficult to handle, I think, increasingly difficult to handle, and got worse as the months went on, until they finally were evacuated.
Until the flag came down at Haifa, as we saw.
Well, the British did. Of course, the Jewish and the Arab members of the police force carried on, and they were left behind to try and do what they could in the new circumstances. But nobody knew what the new circumstances were going to be. They knew what they were supposed to be because it was laid down in the United Nations resolution, but it didn't happen.
Yep.
And it certainly didn't happen in Jerusalem, which was supposed to be a neutral zone under the United Nations partition, and turned out to be the centre of the fighting.
Yes.
Or at least a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's turn to the reasons why the British government post-war decided to pull the plug. One episode, very striking, the King David Hotel bombing by the Irgun in 1946, which killed 91 people, British, Jewish, Arab. Would you say that was a turning point for the British government? I'll just add that in that period, 45 to 48, Britain lost just over 1,000 service personnel killed in Palestine, a very striking number, and largely as a result of Irgun and Haganah and other acts. Yeah. But would you say that was a turning point, or that it was a kind of incremental change?
Yes, it was certainly a very significant event. The King David Hotel was a very important building itself. It was a prestige hotel which had been built not long before, and had been built to be the Ritz of Jerusalem, etc., and was very striking, and still is, of course, a very splendid hotel and its decoration. But at that time, one wing of it was requisitioned by the British government. It wasn't a police or it was a government headquarters, but it had both police and a lot of army too were there, of course. And the bombing of that was like bombing Buckingham Palace, if you see what I mean. It was iconic in that sense, as well as for the number killed in a single incident. Because although there were very large numbers killed, as you say, over a period, the other thing was, of course, it came after the Second World War was already over. The news had been dominated by the Second World War for as long as that went on, and killings that took place in Palestine were not important by comparison to what was going on in the main war, the Second World War. But by that time, of course, the Second World War had finished, and there was no other violence on the same scale, and that it certainly drew it to more people's attention in Britain, I think, at the time.
Thank you very much, Lord Cope. As with previous speakers, we will transmit to John the comments that have come in during the conversation that I had with him.